So I'm Cora. I'm the Director of Multimedia and Manatee Research Associate for the Save the Manatee Club. We're a nonprofit organization located here in Maitland, Florida, close to Orlando, where we really do work statewide. Our focus is on outreach and education, legal advocacy for manatees, as well as assisting with manatee rescue, rehabilitation, release, and research. So in today's presentation, I want to give a short introduction about manatees. Then I will talk about some of the threats manatees are facing. Following that, I'm going to do a quick overview on how to actually spot and report sick and injured manatees, because like Stephen pointed out earlier, we want to talk about what we can do to help. So I think it's really important for everyone to sort of know how to spot and report manatees, especially at this time of year. I'll touch a little bit on the current issues, what's going on with manatees right now. And then we're going to talk a little bit about ways to help. So what can we do to help manatees? And then, like Stephen said, we're going to do a Q&A afterwards. So you can either way ask your questions live, or you can put them in the chat. You can also put them in the chat while I'm talking. We'll do them everything together at the end. So the Florida manatee is a large, slow-moving marine mammal. They average about 800 to 1,200 pounds. We do have some individuals that get much larger than that. The females usually get larger than the males, and that's because they have the calves. So it's not uncommon to see a female manatee that is way over 2,000 pounds, especially over Blue Spring. We do have some rather big ones. The gestation period for manatees, so the pregnancy, is about 13 months. So it's about a year. And they usually have one calf every 2 to 5 years. And they do take care of that calf for about 1 to 2 years after birth, before the calf is being weaned. So reproduction is fairly slow. Sometimes they do have twins, but it is pretty rare. The closest relative to the manatee is actually, believe it or not, the elephant. A lot of people think it's the dolphin, the walrus, or whale, but the elephant and the manatee actually have a common ancestor. Manatees are generalist herbivores, which means they are vegetarian, so they only eat vegetation, and they can really eat a large variety of vegetation. So obviously, as we all know, they do eat seagrasses, therefore the name sea cow. They also eat freshwater grasses, submerged vegetation, emergent vegetation, as well as some floating vegetation. So especially in the St. Johns River, you can see them eating small water lettuce, water hyacinth. They'll eat hydrilla, pennyworth, alligator weed, coontail, and some shoreline vegetation as well. So they're really not all that picky. You know, whatever is fair game, whatever is green and they can reach it, they will most likely try it. And manatees do migrate seasonally. So in terms of habitat, manatees are found in warm tropical and subtropical waters. So we can actually find them in salt, fresh, and brackish water. So you'll usually see them in shallow water, because that's where the vegetation grows that they're eating. So you can see them in rivers, shallow coastal areas, lakes, as long as they're connected to an open waterway, as well as in springs. So right now, I assume most of you will be familiar with Blue Spring State Park. That's the photo I put here on the slide, and that's a manatee aggregation. And right now, this is the perfect time of year to actually see these guys at Blue Spring. The range of the Florida manatee is primarily around Florida. However, in the summer months, they do migrate to the surrounding states, such as Georgia, the Carolinas, Alabama, and Louisiana. And then we do have some adventurous manatees like Chessie, who actually traveled all the way up to the Chesapeake Bay. And we've had some manatees that do travel up to Rhode Island or Massachusetts. But then in the wintertime, they basically all come back down to Florida. And that's because they need the warm water. They do prefer temperatures above 72 degrees. And anything below 68 degrees for a prolonged period of time becomes dangerous for manatees. So right now, when the coastal waters or the river drops below 68, that's when they usually seek out these warm water sources, such as springs or power plants. And like I said, they can be found in multiple different types of water. So a little bit about the manatee status. They are listed as a threatened species, and manatees are protected under several different laws. The Endangered Species Act on the federal level, as well as the Marine Mammal Protection Act, and then on the state level, the Florida Manatee Sanctuary Act. They were downlisted in 2017 by the US Fish and Wildlife Service from the endangered to the threatened category. And that was basically based on the growing numbers of manatees. So when record keeping first began, sort of in the 1970s, early 80s, they counted about 1,200, 1,500 manatees. In recent years, that number has been more around 6,000. So the numbers have definitely gone up, but so have the threats. And one really important thing to keep in mind is that manatees were actually never put on the endangered list due to low numbers. They were put on that list because of the threats that they were facing. And as we'll see further on in the presentation, those threats have actually gone up over time. So this is really something to keep in mind. And like I said, manatees are not very fast to reproduce. So unfortunately this year, as many of you may have heard, we have lost over 1,000 manatees. And that's a record-breaking number. The previous record was 830 manatees. That was already really high. And if you're looking at losing over 1,000 animals in one single year, having 6,000 manatees statewide is actually not that big of a number overall. So that's important to keep in mind. And then in addition to the mortalities, which that's what we're hearing about in the news, right? We also had, as of November 19th, 132 rescues. And that number has already gone up. I just told Stephen, I just returned from a manatee rescue myself today. So that number is already going up as well. So lots of manatees that have been rescued this year as well. So manatees have actually no natural predators. They can be found in the vicinity of alligators as well as sharks. For those of you who've been to Blue Spring or who have maybe watched our webcams, we oftentimes see manatees and alligators very close together at Blue Spring, and there's usually no aggression between the two species. So they are listed as a threatened species, formerly endangered, but they have no natural predators. So what's going on with these guys? So the number one threat, human-related threat and cause of death is collision with watercraft. Manatees are very slow-moving animals. They usually go about 3 to 5 miles an hour, and that makes them a prime target for fast-moving boats. So most manatees that you see out in the wild have some sort of scar pattern from these collisions. And that's actually what researchers like myself used to identify individual manatees. This is Manatee Alice here at Blue Spring with her little calf, and obviously she's pretty easy to identify by that zebra-looking like pattern on her back. So this year alone, we have already lost at least 92 manatees due to watercraft collisions. That number is sort of on the low side. If you're looking at the statistics right now, you'll actually realize that over 500 manatees were not necropsied, meaning they did not do an autopsy on the animals, so the cause of death was not determined. So a lot of these animals potentially could have been watercraft as well. I put this little graphic here because I personally find this kind of interesting to look at. What you see in red over here is actually the manatee's lung. So they have extremely large lungs extending all the way from their shoulder area down towards their tail. And if they get hit by a boat anywhere on their back, they can potentially break a rib, which you can see is located right over their lungs. And then they can potentially puncture a lung. And that's when it can become dangerous for the manatees, because that can be a pretty severe injury. They may not be able to dive down. They may be floating high on the surface of the water. So usually those kind of injuries affecting the lungs can be life-threatening for them. So some of the things that we can do, I thought I'd throw this slide in here right now because we just talked about the watercraft. So what can we do about these watercraft collisions? Number one is really to go slow in manatee habitat and obey posted speed zones. So if you see an idle speed or slow speed sign, that's a good indication that this is manatee habitat. So going slow is the number one thing we can do. Wearing polarized sunglasses, a really good idea, not just if you're boating. If you happen to go out to, say, Blue Spring or another site where you want to see manatees, wearing these polarized sunglasses can really be sort of a life-changing experience because you can actually see through the water, avoid all that glare, and actually see the manatees. So good thing to have. Also looking out for manatee snouts and footprints. So a manatee footprint is this sort of circular pattern that you see here in the picture on the left-hand side that the manatee makes with its tail when it's swimming. So if you see that sort of going on the water, that's a good indication that there is a manatee around as well. And then I'm going to go into this a bit more towards the end of the presentation. reporting dead, injured, or orphan manatees to the FWC. This is a very important number to have. I can't stress this enough. Anyone who is living by the waterways or boating, kayaking, paddleboarding, whatever it is that you may want to do, try to program that number into your phone or have a decal or sticker with you that has that number on it. That would be the number to call. And Save the Manatee Club does provide signs, waterway cards, as well as boater packets and all kinds of other things that you can find on our website. There's a decal that I put here on the slide. This is just one example of the signs that we have that we provide free of charge to the public and the boating community. So those are all things that can be ordered from our website. So the next issue manatees are facing are entanglements. Lots of manatees get entangled in monofilament line, crab traps, or other debris. So the manatee here on top of the slide, this is actually manatee Una. We had to rescue her Blue Spring twice now for very severe entanglement in that fishing line. And especially for females, this can become an issue because they're actually nursing their calves from mammary glands that are located behind the flipper. So if the mother has very severe entanglements or very severely infected flippers, that can potentially actually affect the growth of the calf if the calf cannot nurse properly. So it's very important to recycle fishing line. There's these beautiful containers, usually next to boat ramps or fishing piers where you can recycle your line. It's important to not just throw it in the regular trash can because birds or whatever, raccoons can just take it out and put it right back where it came from. So these bins are the perfect fit for that. And then other debris, I just wanted to show this picture here of manatee Schwinn, also a Blue Spring. He was entrapped in a bicycle tire 2 years ago. We don't know exactly how he got in there, but he was growing and the bicycle tire obviously was not. And we tried to rescue him multiple times, never able to catch him. And luckily the tire eventually came off by itself. So Schwinn is back at Blue Spring now, tire free, but it's really important to remember to just not, throw anything out there that they couldn't potentially get entangled or entrapped in. And then last but not least, it's really important that if you see an entangled manatee to actually call the FWC and not try to remove that entanglement yourself. Especially when it comes to crab traps, oftentimes what people do trying to help is they cut off the floating ball that's attached to the crab trap, but the actual trap or the line is actually still entangled on the manatee. And then it's really difficult for biologists to relocate that manatee because that floating buoy is gone. So they can't find it. And oftentimes, as you can see in this picture here, the line is really severely wrapped around the animal. So you don't just want to cut that off. I mean, this animal actually needs treatment, antibiotics, those kind of things. So really needs to be brought in for treatment. It's really important that, if you do see that, try to report it and not try to remove that yourself. Just a really quick note here on manatee tracking, because a lot of people sort of get entanglements confused with manatee tracking devices. So I just wanted to throw these pictures in here, just a little bit of information about what these devices look like and what they're used for. So as you can see here, these two manatees, or three manatees, are outfitted with these satellite tracking devices, and they consist of a belt that goes around the manatee's peduncle, which is the part where the tail meets the body. And then a 3 to 4 foot long tether attaches to the floating tag on the surface. And that tag can dive down with the manatee. It's not always on the surface, but that's when it's transmitting data to the satellite. And those devices are outfitted with all kinds of things, sonar, VHF, the satellite transmitter itself, that sends information to the researcher's computer so they can see where the manatee is, what it's doing, all those kind of things. And again, if you do see one of those tagged manatees, you should also report that to the FWC. The devices are designed to come off. So if the manatee gets tangled on something, it basically just needs to pull and then the whole thing will fall apart. And it happens pretty frequently. So sometimes manatees are tagged for specific research studies, and oftentimes they are tagged if they were rescued as a really tiny orphan. And then after rehabilitation, they go back out into the wild. We want to make sure that these animals adapt to life back out into the wild. So somebody during the introductions mentioned Lawrence. He's actually a manatee we just released at Blue Spring on Tuesday, and he's wearing one of those tracking devices. So that lets researchers sort of know where he is and if he's doing okay. And then if they see that he is, the device will be taken off. Another issue manatees are facing are algae blooms, and that's really been sort of all over the news this year. So I'm pretty sure a lot of you are familiar with this already, but there are the different types of algae blooms. So one is red tide, which usually occurs in salt water, mostly in Southwest Florida, although this year we've also seen it pretty heavily in the Tampa Bay and St. Petersburg area, as well as in the Florida Panhandle. So this is it's a naturally occurring phenomenon, really, that occurs offshore, but it can really then be fueled by nutrients once it moves inshore, and then instead of dispersing, it just sort of stays there and creates this super bloom. And that's affecting manatees in different ways. They can inhale the toxins when they're breathing, or they can ingest them with the seagrasses that they're eating, and that can cause pretty severe seizures and then potentially drowning if the animal is unable to come to the surface to breathe. Another issue are these blue, green, or brown algae blooms, which we usually see in freshwater. And we've seen quite a few of those especially in the Indian River Lagoon area in Brevard County. And over the years, these algae blooms that are fueled by nutrients from all different kinds of sources, including leaking septic tanks, malfunctioning sewer systems, fertilizer, agricultural runoff, a slew of different things, creating these blooms that are then really clouding the surface of the water so that the sunlight cannot reach the seagrasses. Seagrasses need sunlight to photosynthesize, right? They're plants. So if they can't do that, they'll die off. And then in terms, the manatees are losing this really important food source. And that's what's been happening in the Indian River Lagoon over many, many years. So for red tide, we usually see those effects right away. You know, red tide is happening and the manatees are dying. With these blue, green, and brown algae blooms, we oftentimes see a bloom, and then years later, we really see the full effects, because now the seagrass is gone and now the manatees suddenly are out of a food source. So it's really important to sort of think long term and not just, okay, well, we don't see any dying manatees right now, so apparently this is not having an effect. Well, 5 or 10 years from now, it actually is going to have a very severe effect. And then last but not least is the loss of warm water habitats. So manatees, although they look really bulky and fat and blubbery sort of, they only have about an inch of fat layer. So in the winter time, they migrate to these warm water sources to stay warm. And a lot of manatees have over time learned to depend on the warm water outflow from power plants, as you can see in this picture over here. So some of the older plants are going to be retired in the foreseeable future. And right now there are not really contingency plans in place to try to figure out how to move those manatees away from these artificial warm water sites. They have a very high site fidelity, meaning that they've learned to come there year after year after year, and the calves learn from their moms. So it's kind of hard to just tell them, well, you know, you should be going north and make a left and you're going to Blue Spring. It's not as easy to tell them that. And then natural springs are experiencing their own problems from reduced flow, from overpumping and withdrawal of groundwater for human consumption. And it's really important to protect these springs because they are going to be the habitat that manatees are going to be relying more on in the future, especially when these power plants are going offline and they don't have that habitat anymore. So now I just want to do a quick slide on how to spot a sick manatee, because oftentimes people, you know, see and I think, you know, something might be wrong with this animal, but they don't quite know what it is. And then if they do know what it is, well, what am I going to do about it? So here's a few common signs to look out for. First of all, you want to see if the manatee has any fresh or open wounds. So like I said before, most manatees have some sort of scar patterns from previous boat collisions. Those are usually not something we need to worry about, but those fresh or open wounds, especially if they're sort of pink or red in color, that's an indication that that manatee has recently been hit and is potentially in trouble. Then you want to look and see if the manatee is floating high on the surface of the water or probably listing to the side. That could indicate a lung injury, for example. So if the manatee is trying to dive down and it pops right back up, sort of like a cork, that's a good indication that something is wrong. You also want to monitor the manatee's respiration rate. So this is actually one of the most important things to do. A healthy manatee, when they're active, they usually breathe about every 2 to 5 minutes. They can stay underwater for up to 20 minutes when they're sleeping or resting. But a manatee that's in distress may actually breathe as often as every 30 seconds. So if you're concerned about a manatee, I'm pretty sure everyone has their, you know, smartphone or a watch or something like that. it's a really good idea to time their breathing for like 10 or 15 minutes and see sort of what the breathing pattern is. It's actually one of the first things that the rescue crews would be asking you if you call them, what's the respiration rate? Because that can indicate all kinds of problems, from boat strikes to cold stress to red tide exposure, all those kind of things. At this time of year, like I said, manatees are susceptible to cold stress. So you'll see manatees that have these white lesions on their bodies, usually on their snouts and on their tails and flippers. They're also very thin, can be very lethargic. So this is definitely something to look out for. You also want to look out for orphaned calves or emaciated manatees. So if you can sort of see the ribs or the skull showing, that's obviously a sign that the manatee is emaciated. And like I said, manatee calves usually stay with mom for about 1 or 2 years. So if you see a very small manatee by itself with no adults around, that's most likely an orphan and that cannot survive on its own. So again, something you would want to call in. And then last but not least, tidally stranded manatees. Manatees are fully aquatic animals. They don't come out to haul, they don't haul themselves out to bask like a seal or a sea lion or a walrus would do. So if you see a manatee that's beached itself, that's definitely something you want to report. And it's important to remember to not try to push that back into the water yourself. First of all, manatees, they're very docile animals, they're gentle giants, but they're extremely strong. So even for very experienced rescuers, they have to be very careful moving manatees, especially if they flip themselves over or they slap their tail. So you definitely don't want to try to, be too close to them and try to push it back into the water yourself. So then if you have determined that something is indeed wrong with the manatee, how are you going to report it? So again, this is the number to call. It's the FWC hotline. This is a 24/7 hotline. So they have different field stations and you'll call the dispatch and they will then direct you to the correct field station for your area. If possible, stay with the manatee while you're waiting for the rescue crew to arrive. Like I said earlier, measuring its respiration rate, that's really important. And then if possible, take a picture or video of the manatee. However, obviously without disturbing it. You don't want to get too close and get that beautiful close-up shot and at the same time the manatee is leaving the area because it's being disturbed. So if you can safely do so, take a photo and a video. That's really helpful for the rescue crew to determine what's going on with the manatee. So just a quick summary here, who all is involved with the manatee rescue, because it is certainly not just us, Save the Manatee Club, and it's certainly not just FWC. It's really a huge partnership of so many different agencies. And these are just the agencies that are partners of the Manatee Rescue and Rehabilitation Partnerships. So on the federal and the state side, as well as all the ocean area, taking care of these rehabilitating manatees, and a lot is going on the county level as well. Volusia County has the manatee stranding team. They're very involved in manatee rescues, especially in Volusia County. Brevard County has the Brevard Zoo. So there's many more partners that are not necessarily on this one slide. But just to give you sort of an idea that there's really a ton of different partner agencies involved and not just one agency doing it all. So now I've already touched on some of the current issues, but just to sort of summarize it, right now, what manatees are primarily facing is the seagrass die-off in Brevard County and the Indian River Lagoon. That's also causing issues with capacity for rescue and rehab. There's a lot of manatees in need of rescue, and there's only so much rehab space. So a lot of different partners are working together, bringing more facilities on board to care for these rescued manatees. Like I said, this year alone, over 130 manatees have been rescued, and we're just starting the winter season again. So there's potentially more manatees in need of rescue and rehabilitation. And just a brief issue I wanted to touch on is the topic of provisioning of feeding manatees, because that's something that's currently being discussed and it's been in the news. So I'm pretty sure there's probably some questions about that. So it is being considered to potentially provide supplemental feeding for those manatees, primarily in the Indian River Lagoon. Obviously, feeding manatees or watering them is against the law, so it would only be done under special permitting by permitting agencies. But that itself comes with a whole slew of problems, because you definitely don't want to habituate these manatees to people more than we have to. I mean, a manatee that's being fed by people is going to associate people and boats with food, and that's not a good thing. At the same time, you also don't really know what these wild manatees are accepting in terms of food sources. So if you're thinking, you know, we're just going to throw a couple of heads of lettuce and cabbage in the water and they're going to chow down on that, that's not necessarily the case. You know, they may not know what that is. They may not readily accept it. So the worst thing you could do is introduce additional nutrients by throwing cabbage and lettuce and whatever in the waterway, and they're not eating it and it's decaying, and you're adding more nutrients into an already compromised system. So it's a very tough topic, and no decision has been made on that yet, but it is being discussed. So now I want to go over some ways to help, because this is not all negative. This is not all, you know, I don't want to end this on a pessimistic note. So there's definitely things that we can do. And this slide is just supposed to sort of provide you with an overview. This is not by no means all inclusive. If you want to learn more, savethemanatee.org/algae is actually the page that we put together specifically on this topic. And we're constantly, basically daily and weekly updating it. So it features a lot of the partner projects we're working on. It features things that individuals can do. And it also has some more information, background information to learn about the topic. So again, first and foremost, like I already said, reporting sick and injured manatees is the most important thing. And so we're not seeing, you know, more mortalities. We're actually trying to get these animals rescued that are in distress before it's too late. Another thing is fertilizing responsibly or not fertilizing at all, especially during the summer months. You know, anything that goes onto the lawn, especially right before a rainstorm, it's going to wash off and it's going to eventually end up in a waterway. Even if you're not right next to the waterway, anything that you throw onto your lawn, you know, can wash off. So planting native plants, for example, is a good way. Those plants may not need any fertilizer. They may not need as much water as the pristine St. Augustine grass. And so although this may not seem like the #1 thing to help a manatee, in the long term, it actually really is. Also getting a septic tank inspected to make sure it works correctly, or if you have the option to convert septic to sewer, again, that's a possibility as well. Participating in living shoreline projects. Instead of having these armored seawalls, having mangroves or plants on the shoreline is actually providing more stability and is providing habitat, not just for manatees, but also for all these other little critters that, you know, live in that habitat. A lot of partner agencies are now working on oyster and clam restoration, as well as seagrass replanting projects. So these projects are being explored, but again, I always like to say it's a marathon, it's not a sprint. It's very difficult to just replant the seagrasses and expect them to do really well in a polluted system. You know, you can't just replant them and think they're going to do great. So cleaning up the underlying problems is really the #1 thing we need to do to then be able to plant those seagrasses and have them grow and do really well and provide food sources for those manatees. You can also assist researchers with sightings of manatees. So now this is not a sighting form to report sick and injured manatees. This is just to report sightings. And that's actually really important, because a lot of researchers don't even really know exactly where the manatees are. So for example, last year, some of you may be familiar with Gemini Spring. For the first time in a really long time, we actually saw manatees at Gemini Spring. And those were individuals that we knew from Blue Spring. But we knew this through public sighting reports. So if we had known that, we probably wouldn't have gone out there to look. So it's really important. This is the link, the savethemanatee.org/sightings. We're actually just about to launch a mobile compatible app at that site. So you can you know, put the sighting information in there. You can add photos and videos and GPS coordinates. So it makes it really easy, and you can just hit the send button and it will all be sent to our biologists. And then last but not least, like I also put in the chat, you can donate to Save the Manatee Club or adopt a manatee. That makes a really great gift, especially around the holidays. We have over 30 manatees, a lot of them at Blue Spring, that are in our adoption program. And you can become a member through adopting a manatee. And we also provide funding for our partners for these rescue, rehab, and release efforts. So if you go to savethemanatee.org, there's different ways to allocate your donation. So you can pick, for example, the Emergency Rescue Fund, which that fund goes directly towards rescuing manatees and matching donations to get them over to the rescue and rehab partners. And last but not least, this is the last point here, signing up for our newsletter and our action alerts. You can do that, savethemanatee.org/sign up. So this would be, if you're interested in becoming involved or knowing about the topics that are ongoing. Oftentimes we need the public's help with a petition or with an issue in a certain area, whether that's in Volusia County or maybe it's a Florida-wide issue, and we need the public support. So every time something like this comes up, we send out an action alert, so that way we can keep our members engaged. And that is pretty much it for the presentation. So I'll be happy to take any questions, anything additional that I may have not touched upon. So, and then here's my email. So if anyone has any questions that they don't want to ask, or any follow-up information, you can always email me, and I'd be happy to get back that way as well. So thank you. So I have a question here. It says, can solar power be used to create water fountain for warming the water when the power plants are retired? If we can create wave pools, then can we create wave ponds via solar power for manatees? So I know that solar power has been explored as an option. I don't know exactly where we're at with that. I will actually, since I don't have the full answer for this, I'm going to direct that to our executive director to get back to. I know that this was something that was explored, but I don't know in how big of a fashion, sort of, you know, if they were thinking about replacing sort of the power plants with solar, or if they were trying to put smaller sort of solar stations out so that they would have smaller sort of warm water habitats, which that would be a lot better than having one huge thing where all the manatees go and then all the food sources are depleted nearby. So that's a good question. I unfortunately don't know where we're at with that, but it's definitely something I can look into. And then there was another question, I think the same, Carleen. Do we need to stop the nutrients from farmers? So long term, how can we persuade them to lower nitrogen? That's a good question too. Unfortunately, I don't have the answer for this either. I know that farming and agriculture are obviously a huge issue in terms of contributing nutrients to the waterways as well. It's not just private citizens, it's obviously corporations and farmers as well. So I don't have the answer for that, but again, it's something I'm going to direct to our executive director, so hopefully we can answer it that way. All right, I have, let's see, what else we have. Do you have volunteers and what do they do? Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, let me put that in the chat here too. This is our site for savethemanatee.org/volunteer. All right, so we do have several volunteer opportunities. Most of our volunteers help us either way with outreach and education efforts. So we do tabling events. We are at festivals, for example, the Blue Spring Festival. We've done some tabling events at the Lionia Center in Deltona. So a lot of our volunteers help us with that. We also have volunteers that help us with doing presentations specifically for like school children, anything from kindergarten to high school. We provide the presentations and train them, and then the volunteers help with that. We also actually have our Blue Spring Manatee Observer program in the summertime. So we have a pool of volunteers, and this is a program we're doing in collaboration with Blue Spring State Park, Volusia County, and the Clearwater Marine Aquarium Research Institute. So we have volunteers that actually help us out at Blue Spring in the summertime, educating people about manatees and trying to prevent harassment. So all those opportunities are listed on our websites. If you're interested in any of them, you can check them out or email us specifically, and we can definitely provide some more information on that as well. All right, how long do manatees live? Yeah, it's actually a really great question. So manatees can actually get really old if they're undisturbed in the wild. So the oldest manatee on record was 69 years old. He was living in a captive setting. He was born in captivity, like way back when. So, you know, not a natural setting, obviously. But we do have some manatees at Blue Spring that have actually been around since Jacques Cousteau did his documentary back in the 1970s. So you know, you can do the math. If they were already around in 1970, they're probably now in their 50s, maybe even 60s. They weren't calves at the time. So they can live a pretty long life. Unfortunately, the average lifespan right now is between 7 and 13 years of age. And that's because of the threats that they're facing. And it's also because a lot of young manatees, perinatal, that's what we call perinatal deaths, die. So that's why the average is so low. So if you're adding all these really young manatees, then obviously the average goes down. A good question here from James. Are orphans ever adopted by adult female manatees in the wild? Yes, absolutely. So manatees actually have the ability to adopt orphan calves, and it does happen quite a bit. That's why usually before any orphan rescue is initiated, we really want to make sure that we're actually dealing with an orphan and we're not just dealing with somebody who may be adopted, because if it gets adopted by a female out in the wild, that's sort of the best case scenario, because you really want those manatees to spend the first 1, 2, or 3 years of their lives out in a natural setting, learning how to find warm water, how to find food, how to avoid boats. You know, that's all things that they cannot be taught in a captive setting. So if a manatee gets adopted, all the better. We've definitely had that happen at Blue Spring. Unfortunately, we also have situations where earlier today we did have an orphan at Blue Spring, and unfortunately we observed it for a couple of days now, and it was just being pushed around by multiple females, and it was not being nursed and latched onto anyone. So the decision was made that we had to bring that one in. But yes, they do get adopted sometimes. All right, let's see if anyone else has any questions in the chat or want to ask live, whatever works.
Cora, this is Arnett. I just wanted to say that it was a really good presentation, and I have given several adoptions as gifts to people, and they really liked it. I did it last year, and everybody wanted me to renew their adoption. So that's a recommendation I make. It's really a nice feature, and they enjoy it. So, way to help.
Thank you. Yeah, the adoption program is really, it's a cool thing, because actually all the manatees in the program are real living manatees. So like I said, many of them are wintering at Blue Spring, so people can actually come to Blue Spring and see their adoptees. I mean, I can't promise that they're going to be there on the day you're visiting, because they're wild animals, you know, they come and go, but we do provide daily updates on which adoptee has been seen. We put them on our social media, we put them in our on our website and our newsletter, so people can sort of follow their adoptee along and see, you know, has it been seen? Has it had a calf? You know, who is it hanging out with? Those kind of things. So, and there's all different adoptees. We have some that go back to the 1970s, like Merlin and Brutus. They've been around for a really long time. And we just added Manatee Leslie and Una. They were recently rescued and released, and they're back at Blue Spring now. So, you know, if you're looking for a youngster or you're looking for somebody who's been around for a long time, there's a wide variety.